Good morning. You are watching the service at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Flint, and I thank you for joining us today. I'm Sue Owen Kinsey, a member of this church, and our speaker today is Dean Drake. Dean is many things. He's an engineer, a former member of this church, was our moderator, and once we get back together again, those of you that haven't seen our sanctuary can enjoy it. He helped design it. And we want to thank him for coming. Dean has given speeches here before, and he always leaves us thinking about something and also with some hope in our hearts for better times to come. This is a place where I can be my authentic self. I find the UU faith very strengthening in times where I'm disheartened and feel very isolated. I know there are other people feeling the same way, and people that will accept me and accept the fact that I don't believe what they do, but that's okay. We have 7 principles, and these are listed on our website, and you can find them. And one of the most important ones, I feel, is the first one, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. I follow that, or I attempt to. I'm not perfect, and I don't always manage it. But to me, that means I don't have to love everybody. I don't even have to like everybody. But I do need to respect them and to realize their opinions, their ideas, their paths are different from mine, but they're just as valid to them as mine are to me, and we all need validation. And this place is a home for me, especially with its emphasis on social justice. This is a place I have found my spirituality. Now for some announcements. We will be having a Christmas Eve service, and no, it will not be the typical one where the lights go down at the end and we all hold hands and sing Silent Night. But we'll still have it. It'll be different. It's going to be on December 24th at 6:30. If you'll check the website again, we will be having more details coming throughout the month, and we hope that you and your families at home will take a moment to tune into YouTube and join with other UUs and friends to have a moment that maybe seems slightly normal. Also, we're doing angel trees. Our social justice coordinator, which is Raina Bick, is organizing this, and if you would like to donate and help purchase gifts for some of those people that are in need, and this year the need is more than in past, please contact her or our office, and there'll be more information available on our website. And now we'll begin with the prelude. We begin our service with the lighting of our chalice. In sightless night, terror draws near. Nameless fears of talon and tooth, hopeless yawns before us, an abyss, alone and unknown in the gloom, longing for the dawn. O sacred flame, blaze forth, wisdom brought to life, guide us with the light of hope, the warmth of love, the beacon of purpose and meaning. Because we are afraid of the dark, let there be light. Now we will light our chalice, which is a symbol of our faith. In the sightless night, terrors draw near. Nameless fears of talon and tooth, hopeless yawns before us, an abyss. Alone and unknown in the gloom, longing for the dawn, O sacred flame, blaze forth, wisdom brought to light. Guide us with the light of hope, the warmth of love, and the beacon of purpose and meaning. Because we are afraid of the dark, let there be light.
To worship is to stand in awe under the heaven of stars, before a flower, a leaf in sunlight, or a grain of sand.
To worship is to be silent, receptive, before a stir with the wind or the passing shadow of a cloud.
To worship is to work with dedication and with skill. It is to pause from work and listen to a strain of music.
To worship is to sing with the singing beauty of the earth. It is to listen through the storm to the still, small voice within.
Worship is a loneliness seeking communion. It is a thirsty land crying out for rain.
Worship is the kindred fire within our hearts. It moves through the deeds of kindness and through the acts of love.
Worship is the mystery within us, reaching out to the mystery beyond.
It is an inarticulate silence yearning to speak. It is the window of the moment open to the sky of the eternal.
Covenant. Now we will have the covenant. I read it. Recognizing the richness of diversity, the beauty and wonder of shared worship, and the transforming power of love and service, we gather as a sacred, intentional community to freely seek knowledge and truth, to celebrate the fullness of life, and by our actions to increase the goodness and justice. Well, happy Black Friday. And as you can tell, I have a frog in my throat, so this might be a little bit difficult. The reading is from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were going directly to heaven. We were all going directly the other way. In short, the period was like the present period. Charles Dickens, the English author and part-time Unitarian that wrote The Tale of Two Cities, was without doubt the master of the opening line. Perhaps his most famous opening line was from the story of Ebenezer Scrooge as told in the Christmas Carol. Marley was dead to begin with. My favorite, however, is the one that I just read from The Tale of Two Cities, and the reading that I did was just part of the single opening sentence of the novel. The English do like long sentences. It describes what I think, in this remarkably long sentence, the human condition, which can be summed up, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. And of course, the time that Charles Dickens was referring to was the reign of terror after the French Revolution in 1789. For many of us today, 2020 has been the worst of times. We've seen the worst pandemic that the globe's seen for 100 years. It's sweeping the planet. Our global economy, if people would be honest, is in depression. Our country has been without real leadership for 4 years. On this Thanksgiving weekend, we might well ask ourselves, what in the world is there to be thankful for? But our world has seen other worst of times. Let's take, for example, the year 1943. The U.S. had been in the Second World War for less than 2 years. Most of the 16 million men and women that were to serve in uniform during that war had already been enlisted and drafted, and many of them were away from home and not return until 1945. Most of the 400,000 Americans that were to die in that war, however, had yet to make the great sacrifice. Many families had not seen one another for over a year and had communicated largely through heavily censored letters. And we think wearing a mask is a challenge to our civil liberties. At home, necessities of life were rationed. Every able-bodied man and woman not in uniform were involved in war production. The consumer products that dominated pre-war consumption, such as cars and houses, were banned. And all the worker could do with that excess money was to go out and buy war bonds. There was a sense that in 1943 that the Allies might win the war, but most of the battles that would ultimately determine the outcome had yet to be fought. Even worse for Americans alive in 1943, this was just the latest winter of despair they had endured in the last quarter century. They had lost over 100,000 people during World War I, 675,000 others to the Spanish flu pandemic that came the year later, and endured the Great Depression. And just as the Great Depression was beginning to ease, came the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And we think 2020 was bad. So I think a good case could be made that 1943 could be considered, for Americans, the worst of times. Yet, while we were gripped in total war, Donald G. Connolly and the editors of Mechanics Illustrated were writing an obscure little book to be published in the new year, January 1944. It's the title of our sermon. It was entitled, Your World Tomorrow. Your World, I'm probably, by the way, one of the few people that have actually read this book. It is so obscure. But in the book, Your World Tomorrow makes the case that out of the worst of times could emerge the best of times. A great day is dawning, the book begins. It is the day in which you and I and our children will live out the rest of our lives. It is not a visionary day in the dim remoteness of the future. Rather, it is, in fact, tomorrow. The introduction goes on to explain, the pace of scientific progress increases ever faster and faster. Factories devoted to military production will one day be converted to peacetime purposes. When that time comes, the industry, for the first time in our history, will begin with a clean slate. In other words, this little book is about how America could build back better at the end of the war. Now, I discovered this book when I was 16 years old. I was working on my first job at the public library, earning 75 wonderful cents an hour, and just to take the books and put them away. Well, my intellectual curiosity got the best of me at times, and I would find a book like this one that somebody was returning, and I'd set it at the bottom of the cart so I could check it out at the end of my workday. I read quite a few books that way, including some strange ones like Das Kapital and Mein Kampf, but I like this one better. Wildly off the mark on a lot of the predictions in here, including the fact that we might be flying over the oceans in gliders towed by bombers, Your World Tomorrow had some amazingly accurate predictions. For example, it predicted that the car that I would drive here today in would have, of course, air conditioning. It would have direct fuel injection right into the cylinders rather than a carburetor. And in the fog, and this is the direct quote, individual rays sent forward from your car would warn you of an obstacle ahead. Now, that's quite fascinating for 1944. The prediction about refrigerators, as I reread this book after all these years, was even more spot on. Now, to understand, in 1943, the average person was likely to have a refrigerator that looked like a big box with a cylindrical compressor on the top. There was no technology at all involved in it. But according to Your World Tomorrow, refrigerators would be a long, tall cabinet. Its French-type doors flush with the wall surfaces. The doors are made of translucent plastics, opaque until you touch a control that turns on the light inside the refrigerator. On your new refrigerator, you merely press another recessed container on the side of the box, and out tumbles an ice cube, or as many as you wish. From an external spigot, you can get ice water. Now, that pretty much sums up most modern refrigerators today. Your World Tomorrow also had another interesting prediction for the kitchen. It says, cooking is accomplished in a matter of 3 to 4 seconds. It is done by shooting high-frequency radio waves through foods which, being poor conductors, react by generating lightning-like internal heat. In other words, it said we were going to have microwaves. Regarding the new technological marvel of television, which most people, if they went to the New York World's Fair, had seen only a few years before, the book predicted images as big as a wall in natural color, astonishingly true to life. Problems of canned television programs and news events so that you can store them up and view them at your leisure are well within the range of technological solution. Engineers foresee the day when you can hold a personal television screen no bigger than a book in your hand. In other words, they were already thinking about today's widescreen, high-definition televisions, and Kindles and iPads. Just amazing. That was 77 years ago. These prophecies were even amazing to me in 1966 when I first read them. As a 16-year-old, I was enthralled with the whole concept of predicting the future, or what I like to refer to it as technological prophecy. Now, there have been prophets since the beginning of recorded history, But most generally, prophets were those who received a vision of the future from some sort of divine revelation. In many cases, the purposes of these prophecies were to condition people to accept what was to come when it came. You can only think of the many prophecies in the Old Testament about Jesus for you to realize that that conditioned people to recognize someone sometime in the future that met those criteria. Prophecies do play a very valuable role in society. Predictions of what might be in the future do help condition people to accept that future when it arrives. Before the Industrial Revolution, religion and prophecy gave people a vision of a perfect life after death. And the artists of the time rendered that in marvelous detail in their art. Now, technological prophecy gives people a glimpse into the possible alternative futures and that they and their descendants could live in. That was one of the purposes in the depth of World War II, to write a book like this. Now, technological prophecy has a long history. Beginning in the 17th century, as science began to dramatically change the way people lived, prophecies began to shift from the realm of religion to the emerging kingdom of science. Much of the technological prophecy occurs in the genre we now call science fiction. Sinomium, written by Johannes Kepler in 1608, is considered the very first science fiction novel. Jules Verne is perhaps one of the most famous technological prophet, predicting in From the Earth to the Moon, published in 1865, that 3 men would be launched from a giant cannon in Florida, travel to the moon and back to Earth, splash down in the Pacific Ocean, and be picked up by a U.S. warship. This happened a little over 100 years later with the flights of Apollo 8. In 1869, Verne published 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In that book, a character, Captain Nemo, created a giant submarine, the Nautilus, which had a power source that permitted it to remain underwater nearly forever. In the famous Disney 1954 movie of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, it was suggested that the Nautilus was powered by nuclear energy. This was not too surprising because the very first nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus, was launched later that year. Prophecy, it seems, very often can be self-fulfilling. It leads to the creation of the very things we predict. This is particularly true with technological prophecy, which plants the seed of an idea into the minds of scientists and engineers, who then work tirelessly to turn those ideas into reality. Science fiction writers and publications like Popular Science and Popular Mechanics were prophets of progress, but that kind of prophecy did not stop with words. It began with words, but the words became steel and mortar and glass in a very unique institution called the World's Fair. The first truly international World's Fair probably is the great exposition of works of industry of all nations held in London in 1851. Some other famous world fairs included the 1889 Paris World's Fair, which gave us the iconic Eiffel Tower, the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which introduced the Ferris wheel to the world, the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, which introduced, supposedly, the world to hot dogs, hamburgers, ice cream, and peanut butter. Now, that was a very successful prediction of the future. The Chicago Century of Progress International Exposition in 1933 was unlike any earlier World's Fair. Planning began in January of 1928 at the height of the Roaring Twenties. It was a wonderful time when the economy was nothing but growth, growth, growth. While originally intended to celebrate these accomplishments of American capitalism, the onset of the Great Depression transformed the fair into a visionary oasis where people could glimpse the happier, not too distant future, all driven by innovation in science and technology. The fair became, quote, a utopia or perfect world founded on democracy and manufacturing. The World's Fair had been transformed from a more frivolous shopping place where you could buy little pieces and see little pieces of the world of the future into a temple of technological utopia. But the 1933 Chicago World's Fair was just the opening act for the big one, the 1939-1940 World's Fair. Its theme was Building the World of Tomorrow. Its slogan was The Dawn of a New Day, and nearly 45 million people from around the world, which would be the equivalent of about 30% of the U.S. population in 1939, came and saw what the world of the future looked like. And one of those 45 million people was my mother. At the time, my mother was single, 23, and cleaning other people's houses for a living. It was somewhat a Cinderella-like miracle that this poor person from a small town in Ohio ended up going to the World's Fair. But it turned out that one of her best friends in high school, Lucille, went on to become the secretary to the plant manager in a nearby GM stamping plant. And if those of you remember back then, plant managers were the closest thing in the corporate hierarchy to God. And for reasons we can only speculate, her boss gave Lucille a VIP package for two to a trip to the World's Fair. And Lucille decided to take my mother. And when she got there, she, like just about everybody else that went to the fair, went to the fair's most popular exhibit, the Futurama exhibit of General Motors. And there they took a ride that almost like magic took them all over the world that would exist in 20 years in the far-off date of 1960. Now, this was no ordinary ride. I've done quite a bit of research on this. Futurama was an enormous model. Imagine a train set, only 3/4 of an acre. It had 500,000 buildings, little model building, big model buildings. It had 500,000 model cars. 10,000 of those model cars were on model expressways, and they moved. There were 18,000 trees on this display. It started out at ground level, and at its highest point, it was 110 feet high, 11 stories. There was nothing like it in the world before, and nothing like it since. Now, as you rode over this, you got into cars suspended from the ceiling, and as you rode over this model, there was a voice, a microphone, or speakers in the cab, and it narrated what you were seeing and why that was important to the future. Eventually, when you started out, you were very distant from the model because it was ground level. But as you moved along, the model got closer and closer, and the scale got bigger and bigger and bigger, until the last thing you saw on the model was an intersection of a modern city in the year 1960. And then you got out of the car, you walked out of the building, and what you entered was a life-size recreation of that intersection you had seen in the model. You were standing in the world of the future for one brief moment. And after you were shown the world of the future, GM gave you a button. The button said, "I have seen the future." Now, many of the people, including my mother that went there, and perhaps, or most likely, the authors of the book, Your World Tomorrow, had been on the Futurama ride. 30,000 people a day queued up to see it. And when they stepped out on that balcony at the tail end of the Great Depression, and with World War II starting over in Europe, they for a moment stood in the world of the future. They stood there, they looked at it, at what could be built after the war, and in their minds, they saw it was good. I so consider myself lucky to have lived in this era of technological progress and prophecy. I learned from this that however bad things are now, we can make them better. We have the choice and we have the power. But I so feel sorry for people a lot younger than I that never lived through that era, that whose last idea of a vision of the future was George Jetson's. And Star Trek reruns. For them, technological prophecy has been replaced by dystopian prophecy. They see an endless supply of things like the Hunger Games, the Maze Runner, and Snowpiercer. They think that the only choice they have is bad or worse. And that is so tragic. Now, technological prophecy still exists, but it's hidden in laboratories around the world where geeks in lab coats discuss how the technologies of the future, things like fusion reactors, renewable fuels, genetically modified synthetic food, deep space manufacturing, genetic enhancement, and artificial intelligence could be applied to the betterment of all creation. And occasionally, ideas like this are discussed in things like TED Talks and remote parts of the universe, the internet universe, where geeks like me like to dwell. And there are World's Fairs. For example, in 2010, there was a World's Fair in Shanghai, China, that attracted 73 million people. Their theme was Better City, Better Life, and it was an image of how we could turn the cities into something beautiful, something ecologically friendly, and something that people would want to live in. Unfortunately, nearly all those 73 million people were Chinese. And there was virtually no reporting of the fair here in the United States. I think we were ashamed. The last World's Fair held in the United States was the 1964 New York World's Fair, a remnant of which is a giant Uniroyal tire stuck in the ditch off I-75 or I-94 outside of Detroit. That was at the 1964 World's Fair. And sadly, because of this, there may well be a better world tomorrow in other parts of the world. But here, we seem to be talking to ourselves and our children about a permanent dystopia. But as I like to tell my children, it doesn't have to be this way. As we approach the end of this year, 2020, which has not been a good year for many, many of us, it is well worth remembering that great leaps forward often occur after enormous calamities. the visionary 1933 World's Fair and 1939 World's Fair were a reaction to the horror of World War I and the failure of government and business to prevent the Great Depression. With Soviet communism and National Socialism vying to replace democratic capitalism as the dominant economic system in the world, a better path forward had to be found, and it had to be shown. And that was the purpose of those two World's Fairs. And then came World War II. Once again, the world stands near the end of a global war, this time with a virus instead of an army. It has left our economies in a depression. A technology designed to make the world better, the internet, has instead reached into our animal brain and seems to have released the worst part of human nature. The interdependent global world that was forged at the end of World War II is coming undone. The specter of global war has once again become real as the great power nations once again reach that kind of parity that in 1914 led to the First World War. This destruction of so much of our world today can open up the opportunity to create a better world tomorrow. Dystopia is not preordained. We united this year and turned back the greatest threat to our republic in 200 years. If we remain united, we can choose where we go from here. But first we have to envision where it might be. It is still true, as the old saying says, if you don't know where you're going, you're liable to end up somewhere else instead. Like our ancestors that fought World War II, we have an opportunity to start anew. Create the world we want for our children to inherit, and go and make that world a reality. Tomorrow can be the best of times or the worst of times. It can be a time of wealth and equality, or it can be the world of the Hunger Games. We can work together to make the world better for ourselves and our descendants, or we can fight like our chimpanzee ancestors who only wanted to see who gets on top and who gets the most. The future is not preordained. It is limited only by our ability to dream and our willingness to work together to make that dream become a reality. My parents' generation did it. We can do it too. Now, we will now have a brief period of meditation.
Maya Angelou tells us, I have found that among its other benefits, giving liberates the soul of the giver. Giving of your time and talents and treasure is what can liberate your soul. So consider giving online to the uuflint.org or by sending a check to our church office. And thank you for giving your gifts.
where the oil of gladness dissolves all mourning. Oh, we'll build a promised land that can be. Come, land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like water, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll build a land where we bring the good tidings to all the afflicted and all those who mourn, and we'll give them garlands instead of ashes. Oh, we'll build a land where peace is born. Come, build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like water, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll build a land where we bring the good tidings to all the afflicted and those who mourn, and we'll give them garlands instead of ashes. Oh, we'll build a land where peace is born. Come, build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we will carry in our hearts until we are together again. Closing word someplace. Well, I have lost closing words. So I will make them up. Thank you for giving me this time today. This has been a unique experience. But I wanted to talk about this subject because I do believe we are at a unique point in history. If we use this pandemic and this horrible experiment in autocracy that is ending, if we use that not to learn anything, but just time that was spent getting over it so we could go back to the same fights that we were fighting in 2016, the world will not be a better place. Let us all think about, rather, how when the pandemic is over, when this sanctuary will fill up, how we individually and as a community can help make and define a better world. Figure out what your world will be tomorrow.